2. The Panic of 1835. It was the heyday of the nouveau riche, and a life of careless extravagance reigned among the masters. And yet with all this there was something sordid, something forced, a certain feverish unrest and recklessness. For was not all this show and tinsel built upon a groan? W.E.B. Du Bois, of the Black Belt. Amid the trees in the dim morning twilight he watched their shadows dancing, and heard their horses thundering towards him, until at last they came sweeping like a storm, and he saw in front that haggard, white-haired man whose eyes flashed red with fury. Oh, how he pitied him, and wondered if he had coiled the twisting rope. Then, as the storm burst round him, he rose slowly to his feet and turned his closed eyes toward the sea, and the world whistled in his ears. W.E.B. Du Bois, of The Coming of John. The little town in central Mississippi where the killing started no longer exists. It's been overrun by the strip malls and suburban developments that make today's Mississippi, in spite of its dark history, look like so much of the rest of the United States. Yet there are reminders of the time, the first time, though not the last, when the lawless brutality of Mississippi's ruling class transfixed the nation. The moss-shrouded trees lining the sluggish, muddy streams, the vast shimmering fields that in 1835 were the most valuable land on earth, the antebellum houses that were lighted all night that summer, fortified against the very slaves who had built and maintained them, and the hard white heat of the Gulf South sun. By the time it finally happened, there had been weeks of rumors about a planned slave revolt, fear hanging in the fish-bellied sky that finally burst with the cathartic violence of a summer storm. But what happened in the end was less a revolt than a pogrom, a preemptive strike against a conspiracy that may never have existed, and that left at least 16 slaves and 7 whites dead, their backs scored by torture before their necks were snapped and their legs left quivering at the end of the gallows arc. What happened in Mississippi that summer was not the sort of history that Thomas Jefferson had imagined when he had secured the nation's western frontier with the purchase of the vast territory of Louisiana in 1803. In his moments of brightest optimism, Jefferson had hoped to turn the Mississippi River Valley into a Republican Arcadia populated by self-sufficient yeomen, a vast domain of patriarchal household order and non-commercial white male equality. And in his moments of darkest pragmatism, Jefferson had imagined the valley as a destination for the surplus population of black slaves, whom he had increasingly come to see as an insurrectionary threat to American liberty, a vast dumping ground over which a dangerous slave population might be spread so thinly that it would eventually disappear into the fruitful harvest of Republican liberty. But a future such as this, with slaveholders patrolling the night against an army of slaves they thought outnumbered them 50 to 1, lynch mobs closing the courts and arrogating their authority, broken bodies, black and white, swinging side by side from the gallows in the summer sun, was not what Jefferson had imagined. The compressed energy of the contradictions between the vision of social order promised by Jefferson's Empire for Liberty and that represented by the emerging shape of the Cotton Kingdom exploded into large-scale violence in Madison County, Mississippi in the summer of 1835. Madison County had been carved out of the Choctaw land cessions of 1820 and 1830, sitting on the eastern side of the Big Black River, a tributary connecting the county to the Mississippi system. By 1835, the county was in the midst of a furious transformation from a frontier exchange economy to a boom-time cotton economy. In the 5 years leading up to the violence in the summer of 1835, the number of slaves in the county had more than doubled, vastly outstripping the growth of the white population. It is perhaps not too much to say that, when things started to go wrong that summer, the county was sitting on the leading edge of the international cotton market. By the time anyone in Madison County wrote anything down, at least 23 people were already dead, and because they had been executed not by the state of Mississippi, but by a committee of citizens unclothed with the forms of law, those who had taken the law into their own hands felt compelled to justify themselves in a pamphlet addressed to their fellow citizens. We must then read carefully, for the only account of the event we have was an effort to reweave dozens of interrogations and executions unrestrained by law into a story of the orderly unfolding of justice, or, as the pamphlet itself put it, due deliberation and an earnest desire to find out the truth. Given that their actions had been described and questioned in newspaper dispatches that were read and recirculated nationwide, and because they were themselves conceivably facing murder charges in the cases of at least the 7 whites they had put to death, we can only assume that they tried to tell a good story, one that would make the rest of the world see things the way they saw them. What they said they saw and heard was this. From the middle of June, people in Madison had been hearing rumors that an insurrection was being planned among their slaves. After about 2 weeks, it seemed clear to a group of gentlemen in the town of Livingston that the rumor had begun with a white lady who lived at Beatty's Bluff, a small settlement about 9 miles up the Big Black. A group of men from Livingston went up to hear her story, and she told them that at some point that summer the behavior of her house servants had begun to change. They had become insolent and disobedient. They talked about her within her hearing, and she saw them engaged in secret conversation when they ought to have been engaged at their business. So she decided to spy on them, scrutinize their conduct more closely, was the way the pamphlet put it, and her fears were confirmed. She heard one of them say that she wished to God it was all over and done with, that she was tired of waiting on the white folks and wanted to be her own mistress the balance of her days and clean up her own house. Soon afterward, the lady heard another secret conversation, this time carried on between one of her female slaves and a man who belonged to one of her neighbors. They spoke in a tone so hushed that the words barely registered in her straining ear. "Is it not a pity to kill such?" the slave began, and after that the lady could hear no more. The man's reply was clear enough. He said, "It was, but it must be done." That night the lady told her son about what she had overheard. He went and told the enslaved woman that he knew something about what she had been saying, and that she must tell it. Without hesitation or punishment, she told him that what she had said was, "Is it not a pity to kill such a pretty little creature as this?" having reference to a child she then held in her arms. She went on to say that the man with whom she had been caught in conversation had been telling her that there was going to be a rising of the black people soon, and they intended killing all the whites. That was enough information for the group of white men who had traveled up from Livingston. On June 27th, at a large and respectable meeting of citizens, held in Livingston, the assembled white men agreed to set up a system of patrols and committees of investigation that would reconvene in 3 days' time to report if anything new had been discovered. Once the committees of investigation took to the roads, evidence of a conspiracy among the slaves in Madison quickly began to mount. A slaveholder named William Johnson enlisted his driver to investigate the slaves on his plantation, and soon returned to the citizens' meeting with the news that an old man on his plantation had heard there would be an uprising, and knew that a slave named Peter, who belonged to Rural Brake, had plans to break into a store to get gunpowder and shot. It was later determined by the committee that Peter had recently assisted in unloading wagons at the store, and that he had asked what was in the kegs when he was carrying them in. The old man who had implicated Peter was then brought into town and interrogated by the assembled committee. After at first denying that he had ever said anything about Peter or gunpowder or shot, and then receiving a most severe chastisement, the old man confirmed in every particular the statement, and implicated another slave, a man belonging to Thomas Hudnold, whose name was never recorded by the committee. When they went to fetch Hudnold's slave in the field where he was working, he ran off, and though he was run by tracked dogs some 2 hours, he escaped by taking to water. It was agreed by the citizens that he was a desperate villain who had been a terror to the neighborhood for some years, and when several weeks later he was decoyed into Livingston, he was taken directly to the gallows and hanged after confessing his guilt, and saying that it had been Reuel Blake himself who had told him of the insurrection, when Blake and he were in a swamp getting out gin timber. Blake, he said, had given him $5 and told him he would be one of the captains of the Negroes, etc., if he promised he would join. But as the unnamed slaves standing on the steps of the gallows surely knew, it was too late for Blake to be held responsible for whatever he had done in the swamp that day. By that time, Reuel Blake was already dead. The bloody strand of confessions, accusations, and executions that began with a conversation between slaves half overheard by a worried old woman at Beatty's Bluff, and that brought to light a hidden proposal made by a white man in the woods, traces out the process by which the presumptions of social and spatial order upon which the Cotton Kingdom was founded were undermined by the fear of racial insurrection that shadowed its development at every step. Once it was suspected that slaves might conspire with white men, scenes that had once seemed to reflect a sense of order, a slave unloading a wagon at the center of town, a black woman lulling a white baby to sleep, suddenly became images of horrible disorder. Once that happened, all bets were off. The duration of the violence in Madison County would be determined solely by the length of time that the county's citizens were willing to keep torturing out confessions and murdering those they implicated. The line of investigation being pursued by the committee in Livingston was abruptly cut short by the actions of a mob. On the night of July 2nd, the 2 slaves who had thus far been implicated were seized from the jail and lynched. But by that time things had begun to heat up at nearby Beatty's Bluff. The leader of the Citizens Committee there, Jesse Mabry, heard that James Lee, a very close observer of men both black and white, had been spying on an enslaved blacksmith named Joe and a preacher, also a slave, named Weaver, and had heard them say things which confirmed his suspicions. Mabry shared with the committee his suspicion that one of his own slaves, a great scoundrel, must have been in on the plot, and knowing that the slave had been in Joe's shop recently, the committee members conceived a plan for making certain of what they thought they already knew. They sought out Joe in his shop, where Mabry, upon entering, addressed him in the following terms. "Do you know who we are?" When the slave responded that he knew the 2 other men, but not Mabry, the slaveholder contradicted him. I immediately insisted that he did know me, and continued to look him full in the face for some minutes until he began to tremble. When I saw this, I asked him if he knew Sam. Joe admitted that he did know the fellow named Sam, and had spoken with him recently, yet insisted that nothing had passed between them other than what was usual when fellow servants meet. "We then," Mabry continued, and remember this is in a document meant to show that the slaveholders proceeded with care and deliberation, "called for a rope and tied his hands, and told him we were in possession of some of their conversation, and he should tell the whole of it." Joe began to talk. He said that there were several white men actively engaged in the business. He named Reuel Blake, Joshua Cotton, and William Saunders, which might have seemed like a remarkable revelation to the white men in Beatty's Bluff, but wouldn't have surprised anyone in Livingston, where Blake had been implicated the day before. Cotton had been arrested that morning, and William Saunders had disappeared. He also, in answer to what type of question we will never know, said that Weaver was involved, as well as another preacher named Russell and Sam. And he said that the plan was to begin with the conspirators massacring their owners with axes and hoes. They would proceed to Beatty's Bluff, break into a storehouse that held arms and ammunition, then march on Livingston, and then Vernon, and then Clinton, sacking and recruiting all the way to Natchez, where they would kill everybody and rob the banks, before retiring to a place called the Devil's Punch Bowl. Weaver, brought in as Joe talked, said that Joe was lying. When he refused to say anything more than that, he was beaten and put in confinement, while Joe was allowed, for the moment, to go free, and presumably to tell everyone he knew what had happened between him and the committee. Russell, brought before the committee some time after Joe had been freed, also denied knowing anything. Mr. Lee at this time struck him twice, and Russell made a statement that was, in all particulars, precisely like the one made by Joe. The next morning an enslaved man named Jim was brought before the committee, and, Mabry reported, at length he agreed that if I would not punish him any more, he would make a full confession. Jim's story was very much like the one told the previous day by Joe, although he implicated several more slaves as well as a white man named Angus Donovan and another named Moss, both of whom were standing nearby as he was interrogated. Jim also added a detail that seemingly expressed the worst fears and most lurid fantasies of the men who were standing over him with a lash. He told them that the slaves had planned to kill all the whites except some of the most beautiful women whom they had intended to keep as their wives. He went on to say, someone must have pressured him to say, that he had already picked one for himself. Jim, like all of the others who were brought before the committee at Beatty's Bluff, 5 in all, was hung on the afternoon of July 2nd. On and on the interrogators went, in an endless feedback loop of their own suspicions, asking the slaves questions based upon information that everyone involved knew might just as well have been produced by the investigation as discovered by it, acting as if the slaves' information network, which they claimed had been so effective in spreading the news of a massive plot, had ceased functioning the moment that the people they brought before their committee started making statements, torturing anybody who failed to go along with the game. Upon finding that, mirabile dictu, the same questions kept producing the same answers, the committee in Livingston passed a set of resolutions, appointed a 13-man jury, and began hanging people on the morning of July 4th. The pamphlet later published by the Livingston slaveholders contains no record of the trials of the dozen or so slaves they hung during the next several days, but it contains a detailed account of the evidence against each of the 7 white men they put to death. The trials of the slaves were noteworthy for these citizens only in so far as they led to the trials of a group of white men, a group of men whom, it appears, they had been watching for quite some time. The committee began with Joshua Cotton, a native of New England who had lived in western Tennessee before settling near the land office in neighboring Hinds County. Cotton had recently arrived in Livingston, where he set up shop as a Thompsonian steam doctor, an entrepreneurial healer using steam and herb baths to treat everything from gout to consumption. The system had been founded by Samuel Thompson of New Hampshire. There was a lot of evidence taken against Cotton, all of which circled back to a peculiar pastime. Cotton, it seemed, was always hunting horses, following them as they tracked a path across the surveyed property lines, wooden fences, and plowed fields that marked out the emergent pattern of land tenure in Mississippi. Cotton, that is, moved through the landscape in a way that accorded more with the customs of the frontier exchange economy than with those of the cotton boom. There were reports of seeing him skulking around the plantations near Livingston, near Vernon, and near Beatty's Bluff. At another moment he might have just looked like a poor man trying to gain a stake by raising a set of animals for whom he did not have any land. But in the summer of 1835 he looked sinister. His erstwhile partner in steam doctoring, William Saunders, thought he knew the reason that Cotton would suddenly materialize in the middle of another man's farm and then melt away into the forest at its edge. Cotton, Saunders said, had been trying to steal slaves in partnership with a man named Boyd. To provide himself with a cover, he had purchased a number of Spanish horses, which he intentionally turned loose so that he might have a chance to talk to the slaves and instill rebellious notions among them in a way that he could not do by being a steam doctor, like, say, Saunders himself. A slave seized after the executions at Beatty's Bluff confirmed Saunders' account, saying he had been hunting horses at the end of May when he ran into Cotton, who claimed to be doing the same. Cotton had started asking him questions. Was his master a bad man? Were the slaves whipped too much? Would they like to be free? And then he had done something no white person in Mississippi would ever do. He had offered the slave a swig of whiskey and made him drink first. Cotton had then told him his plan for liberating the Negroes, etc. Brought into a room where 6 or 7 white men were chained and surrounded by a crowd, the slave from Beatty's Bluff pointed at Cotton and exclaimed, "That is the man who talked with me in the prairie." Cotton, the committee's pamphlet reported, looked thunderstruck and came near fainting on hearing the enunciation of the boy. And then he began to talk. The first man he named was William Saunders. Saunders, the committee recalled, had recently relocated from Madison to neighboring Hinds County, and in the months since had moved through the landscape in a way that had caught the attention of his new landlord. He would often be out all night and never could give satisfactory explanations for so doing, the landlord apparently testified. And not only that, the gentleman afterwards ascertained that while at his house, and without any reasons therefore, he was often seen not only in remote parts of Hinds, but also in Madison and Yazoo counties. In addition to having been seen out late and away from home, that is, moving differently from the way prosperous white people moved, Saunders was doubly suspect because he knew Cotton. He had, the committee cannily noted, apparently known something of the plot, since he had known enough to try to pin it on Cotton. As they accused each other, Saunders and Cotton were sitting in the same room, each hearing what the other said, and apparently repeating it in a hopelessly played version of the prisoner's dilemma. Saunders was executed on the 4th of July. And so on. Each of the men named by Cotton seemed to have a fragmentary record of mysterious behavior, which folded out into a complete story once an accusation of conspiracy was placed at its end. For example, Albie Dean was known to associate with Negroes, and would often come to the owners of runaways and intercede with their masters to save them from a whipping. He was seen prowling about the plantations, ostensibly for the purpose of inquiring for runaway horses, which he did with great particularity, sometimes inquiring for a black, bay, gray, or other color that suggested itself at the time. He acknowledged that he was in the swamp near Livingston when the notorious Boyd was started by the dogs. Dean was condemned to death on the morning of July 6th and was executed 2 days later. Also accused was Angus L. Donovan. His deportment, some weeks previous to his arrest, was very suspicious, from his intimacy with the Negroes in the neighborhood, being suspected of trading with them. His conduct was so very extraordinary and suspicious as to induce the citizens of the neighborhood to watch his movements. He was repeatedly found in the Negro cabins, enjoying himself in Negro society. After the whippings at Beatty's Bluff had begun, he was caught at the house where the discovery of the conspiracy was made, engaged in earnest conversation with the girls who divulged the plot. When he found he could not be present at the examination of the Negroes, he evinced considerable uneasiness, and kept walking to and fro. Donovan, alone among the suspected conspirators in Madison, was accused of being an abolitionist. He was condemned to death on the morning of July 7th and died with Albie Dean. Reuel Blake was the only slaveholder among those who were put to death. He was of a cold, phlegmatic temperament, with a forbidding countenance, kept himself almost aloof from white society, but was often seen among Negroes, as he worked at his trade of gin-wright. He had opportunities of becoming acquainted with the Negroes on most of the large plantations in Madison. When he was asked to whip the implicated Peter, he did so in such a manner as to convince everyone present that he did not wish to hurt him. When someone else took over the lash, He kept walking to and fro, each turn getting closer to his boy, until the boy commenced talking, when he could stand it no longer, and rushed through the crowd to where his Negro was, and swore if he was touched another lick they would have to whip him first. He was chased out of town, then tracked down in Vicksburg. As he walked to the gallows on the morning of July 10th, he protested his innocence to the last and said that his life was sworn away. As Blake reminded the immense concourse of people who came to see him swung off into infinity, there was no way of knowing whether anything at all had really been happening in Madison County before the Committee of Safety started torturing slaves. The confessions were all coerced. The witnesses were all made aware of what had been sworn against them. The fury of the mob was so out of control that anyone who expressed doubts about the process might soon find himself its victim, and the pressure on a committee that had put at least 16 slaves and 7 white men to death without any pretense of a trial was so great that the committee members might have said anything to make it seem as if they had done the right thing. So we will never know if Joshua Cotton was plotting a full-scale assault on Southern slavery, just trying to steal a few slaves, or simply tracking a bunch of horses that had a knack for repeatedly escaping. Nor will we ever know what was behind the appearances that the committee took as evidence of guilt, why William Saunders stayed out all night and kept popping up all over Mississippi, whether Angus Donovan really enjoyed himself in Negro society, or what Reuel Blake actually was worried about when he tried to keep his blacksmith, elsewhere described as an old man, from being beaten to death. What we can tell from the pamphlet version of the proceedings at Livingston is what made these white men seem so suspicious that they had all apparently been questioned about their activities, warned about their behavior, and subjected to further scrutiny long before the proceedings ever began. They have been described as marginal men outside of social networks, poor men who were not well known by their slaveholding neighbors. But the marginality and poverty of these men had a spatial correlate, one that both their slaveholding neighbors and the surrounding slaves seemed to have noticed. Their class position was literally that, a position, and these men were always out of place. They were far from home in the dead of night. They were on other men's property without being in their company. They were out on the prairie chasing horses, in the swamp being flushed by dogs, or in the woods doing something they could quite never explain to the satisfaction of their slave-holding neighbors. They were in the slave quarters before the proceedings started, and in the way once they began. They were men who violated the emergent code of behavior that was written in straight-line fences, plowed fields, and open roads all across the Mississippi Valley. Landless white men in a landscape being remade by black slavery and private property. As the Empire for Liberty became the Cotton Kingdom, they were woefully out of place. This is not to say that they were primitive rebels fighting for safety-first agriculture, yeoman-style republicanism, and a way back to a time before capitalism, if such a time could even be imagined by a white man in the Mississippi Valley. Just as the residual landscape they so obviously, so balefully, and so fatally inhabited was itself a product of the uneven pattern of speculation and settlement on the cotton frontier, their own presence in that landscape was a reflection of the transformation underway in the Mississippi Valley. Their aspirations, whether they were ultimately about steam doctoring, horse trading, slave stealing, arming the slaves, or robbing banks, were a mirror image of the bubbles of hope that floated the cotton boom. The stories told about the men's territorial trespasses were also stories about racial transgression. They were accused of being men who talked with and traded with slaves, just as they repeatedly violated the cotton boom landscape spatial etiquette. These men violated its code of proper racial behavior. But talking and trading were really the least of it. Just as arresting as the image of Joshua Cotton out on the prairie when he should have been minding the store was the image of Cotton offering his bottle to a black man and then drinking from it himself. and the picture of Angus Donovan trying to insert himself into the interrogations of the slaves at Beatty's Bluff was clearly linked in the minds of his accusers to the sight of him mooning around the slave quarters, enjoying himself and talking with the girls. A white man who would speak of liberating the Negroes with a slave's saliva still wet on his lips. Another who preferred the company of black women to that of the wife he had left behind in Kentucky. The actions of these men called into question their racial integrity. As Henry Foote, a future governor of Mississippi, reported saying to Donovan at the time, "Were you to witness a bloody conflict between the slaves of this country and the white people? On which side would you be?" The execution of a number of white men in the first several days of July concluded what had begun at the end of June as a fear of a slave revolt. The proceedings, which spent pages detailing the evidence against the white conspirators, did not bother to tally the deaths of the numerous slaves who were murdered in the same days. In that way, what happened in Madison County was not so different from what happened countless other times in the history of American slavery. Slaveholders almost always framed their inquiries as investigations of the immediate circumstances of a revolt, rather than as considerations of the system of slavery itself. Instead of thinking that as long as there was slavery there would probably be slave revolts, or trying to fathom the aspirations and political imaginations of their slaves, they reframed revolts and revolt scares as evidence of a set of problems that could be solved within existing parameters. And they set about making a series of reforms, most of which focused on their own behavior and that of their fellow whites. They could control how much preaching or trading or hiring or traveling or steam doctoring their slaves were exposed to, and thus make sure that this never happened again. But the path by which understanding of what had happened in Madison migrated away from any consideration of black self-activity and toward a panic about white men who acted black was a particularly overdetermined one. For, as he went to his death, Joshua Cotton had provided Madison slaveholders with a way to link their own anxieties about space, race, and slavery in Madison County to a wider network of boom-time terrors. In the confession he signed, just before the noose snapped his neck, Cotton claimed he had been a member of a far-flung Klan that was trying to carry into effect the plan of Murrell as laid down in Stuart's pamphlet. Those bookish last words sent a tremor of fear up and down the Mississippi Valley. If there was a white man who embodied the uncertainties and fears that lurked behind the bright white tide of cotton and profit that flowed down the Mississippi River in the boom years of the 1830s, his name was John Murrell. Murrell was the leader of a clan of frontier bandits who swarmed over the Mississippi Valley in the early 1830s, stealing horses and slaves, passing counterfeit bills, robbing travelers, and organizing a massive slave revolt that would stretch all the way to Maryland. Or, at least, that's what Virgil Stewart said. What we know about Murrell comes mostly from a pamphlet published by Stewart in 1835 under the pseudonym Augustus Q. Walton. By that time, Murrell was in jail, hauled in by Virgil Stewart, and convicted wholly on the basis of Stewart's testimony. But Murrell did not simply sit slack-jawed, as Stewart called him out. He was, he admitted, guilty of some of the crimes of which he was accused, but said that Stewart had been his partner. This accusation was hard for Stewart to shake, because he was the only witness to the crimes of which he was accusing Murrell. The slaves he had accused Murrell of stealing, he said, had been transferred through a secret network and sold off somewhere near Yazoo, Mississippi. In order to cleanse his good name of the bad odor of its association with Murrell's crimes, Stewart published a pamphlet explaining how he had captured Murrell, lost sight of the stolen slaves, and, above all, saved the nation from the horror that had engulfed Santo Domingo. That was the pamphlet that was apparently on Joshua Cotton's mind as he prepared to die. There is no way to tell whether anyone else in Madison County had read Stewart's pamphlet, still less whether anyone else had taken it seriously, for many of its initial readers thought it was a joke, before Cotton's confession. No way to tell, that is, whether the pamphlet provided the Madison County Committee of Safety with a roadmap at the beginning of their investigation, or simply a way to rationalize their actions after the fact. What is clear is that the citizens of Madison County and Virgil Stewart came to need one another. Today, the easiest way to obtain a copy of either the committee's report or Stewart's history of his own good deeds, both of which were published in relatively small runs as unbound pamphlets, is an abound compilation of documents relating to the events in Madison County that was issued in a large run by a New York publisher in 1836. There, Stewart's otherwise unproven assertion that Murrell was planning a huge slave uprising as he traveled the Mississippi Valley, and the committee's otherwise implausible suggestion that Madison County had been the site where that rebellion was set to begin, are matched like a set of bogus confessions to a crime that never occurred, or like a pair of wise guy endorsements kiting value out of an unbacked bill. And so, in the end, it does not really matter when the citizens of Madison County first heard of Murrell, or first came to believe that it was his dark purpose that was behind the suspicious movement of their neighbors and the sinister murmuring of their slaves. The history that was made after Cotton's confession was a history in which the meaning many attributed to the murders in Madison County was shaped out of the purposes they attributed to John Murrell, purposes that retraced the pattern of the cotton economy in shadowy negative outline. When Virgil Stewart started to play John Murrell for information, Murrell was a social oddity, if not a theoretical impossibility, a white man who was being legally treated as a slave. In 1833, Murrell had been convicted in Madison County, Tennessee, for harboring 3 slaves who belonged to a man named William Long. The slaves had disappeared and had been found in Murrell's possession, but he claimed to have captured them and not yet, in spite of his best efforts, been able to return them to their owner. That much made Murrell a rogue and an outlaw, but the sentence in the case made him something more. Because Murrell had neither the money nor the property to cover his fine, the judge sentenced him to serve Long for a term of 5 years. Murrell appealed the sentence, but while he waited for a decision, he was again accused of stealing slaves, this time by a man named John Henning, and he apparently decided to leave Tennessee. Henning, by all accounts, hired Virgil Stewart to track Murrell and find the slaves that he was sure the latter man had stolen and had stashed somewhere along the road he would soon be traveling. After that, everything we know comes from Stewart. When Murrell headed out of town, Stewart followed him for several hours and then decided to make his acquaintance. He drew up beside him and introduced himself as a fellow traveler. He was, he claimed, a visitor from the Choctaw Nation, and he was on the road hunting a horse. He used, that is, the guise generally favored by those who stole slaves in order to track a slave stealer who was, in actuality, a runaway slave. On down the road went this oddly inverted couple, and as they traveled, the con man got conned. Stewart later explained that he had been able to stay by Murrell's side all the way across Tennessee and into Arkansas by claiming that, in addition to looking for a horse, he was looking for land. "The land east of the Mississippi River," he confided to his companion, "is all entered, and it is very dear." Their journey quickly veered off the turnpike and into the woods, heading toward Randolph, Tennessee, where Murrell planned to cross the river. After several days of thrashing around in the woods at the river's edge, looking for a crossing and waiting for the water to subside, the pair made it across the river into the morass, a swampy canebrake uninhabited except for a few huts occupied by men and sometimes by Negroes. Farther and farther off the grid of orderly settlement they traveled, deep into an almost impenetrable wilderness, searching for the meeting place of Murrell's clan. Murrell, Stewart recorded, referred to himself and his men as speculators, and when he traveled he identified himself as an agent in the transformation of the Southwest, sometimes posing as a slave dealer out collecting debts, other times as an itinerant minister of the Methodist Church. He had traveled, he claimed, from Virginia to Louisiana, conning, robbing, kidnapping, and murdering along the way, and to Stewart at least, he seemed eager to talk about it. According to Stewart's account of his experience of riding into the woods with Murrell, his mind was filled with strange phantoms, and he began to feel as though he were on enchanted ground. Stewart later said that he had used a needle and a secret system of stenography to scratch notes into his bootlegs, fingernails, saddle skirts, and portmanteau as they rode and talked. These he transcribed on tiny pieces of paper stashed in the lining of his hat. Murrell, Stewart's Murrell, spoke of his past crimes at great length, and by the end of their journey he had provided Stewart with something like a highwayman's map to the vulnerabilities of the antebellum economy. Start with hijacking. Stewart's Murrell had spent time on the Natchez Trace, the pathway through the woods and swamps north of New Orleans that river traders used to walk home after they had sold their goods. According to Stewart, Murrell bragged that in the early days of his career he would select his marks along the road by the way they looked, make their acquaintance, and then rob and murder them. A tall and good-looking young man, for instance, riding an elegant horse which was splendidly rigged off, caught his eye. When the man said he had been to the lower country with a drove of Negroes and was on his way back to Kentucky with cash in his pocket, Murrell offered to ride with him along the dangerous road through the Choctaw Nation. For the trader, that road ended when Murrell pulled him off the road and pointed a gun at his head. When he pleaded to be allowed to pray before he died, Murrell told him, "I had no time to hear him pray," and shot him dead. The man, it turned out, had been a bit of a puff, a phony. The wallet he had told Murrell was full of cash turned out to be stuffed with love letters. Then there was counterfeiting. As he traveled south, at least by Stewart's telling, Murrell would always pick up the tab, paying with a counterfeit note, often while passing himself off as a preacher. The members of the devout Nobbs family, who ran an inn along the banks of the Mississippi, Stewart remembered, were so besotted by the presence of a minister at their dinner table that they tried to refuse payment for the meal. Murrell insisted, apologizing that he had only a large denomination bill for which they would have to make change in coin. On the way out the door, he mentioned in passing that he was hoping to start up a small business breeding mules to pay for his ministry. The Nobbs were only too happy to accept Murrell's note as payment for a mule, although their money was, at that moment, heavy in his pocket. The object for Murrell was less to get things for free. The only load that Murrell planned to make his new mule carry was the weight of a tag noting its price, in cash, than it was to use the cash nexus to turn worthless paper into good money. Indeed, Murrell's method made the economy of capitalist accumulation run backward. The transfer of a thing served as the mechanism by which the seller's money ended up in the buyer's pocket. Virgil Stewart was so impressed with the trick that he gushingly termed Murrell a great man, possessed of unrivaled mental powers, as he recalled the dumb grins that had graced the Nobb family faces when Murrell had bestowed upon them a final bogus benediction. But Murrell's real game was stealing slaves. Like Murrell himself, slave stealing haunted the margins of the cotton economy. For a white man like Murrell, slaveless, ambitious, unscrupulous even by the standard of Mississippi Valley slaveholders, an escaped slave could look like a walking income stream. One white man accused of helping to steal a 12-year-old slave girl named Rachel recalled encountering her along the banks of the Mississippi, explaining that he had only reluctantly acceded to her request for a ride and brought her to his house after observing that she had one of her feet cut. There she remained for 2 days, whereupon he took her to the defendant and left her with him, where she stayed for a year until her owner heard where she was and drove out from New Orleans to repossess her. Although she was treated as a slave in the household of the man with whom she was left, he had her work in his kitchen and tracked her down on the 2 or 3 occasions on which she disappeared. She continued to claim that she was free right up until her legal owner came to get her. Faced with returning to his service, she suddenly admitted she was a slave and begged the family of the man with whom she had been living to buy her. While she was not the free person she claimed to be, Rachel was quite clearly something other than a victim of circumstance. Traveling a landscape populated by white men apparently eager to take advantage of her vulnerability, she searched for the best situation she could find. And what of the man in whose house she was discovered? Had he knowingly harbored a fugitive, trading her board for her labor in the hope of her eventual reproduction, as her legal owner came to suspect? Had he bought her from the man who found her on the road? Or had he simply taken her in because both men agreed that he stood a better chance of finding her rightful owner and returning her than the first man? Had he really tried to spread the news to neighbors that she was working in his kitchen, even as he somehow missed the published notices in the Louisiana Advertiser that was delivered monthly to his home? Although the precise details of the story are unknown, they remain contested during the court case that followed, which concluded with the ambiguous finding that the man in whose house Rachel had been found had behaved in a way that was negligent and remiss but not criminal. The moral of the story remained clear enough. At least on the margins, the social privileges of whiteness, of being able to command the labor of an out-of-place black child found along a country road, could compromise the property rights of slaveholders as well as the aspirations of their escaping slaves. Similar stories are threaded through the court records of the antebellum Mississippi Valley. 3 slaves named Tom, Brunswick, and John disappeared from the plantation of Shepley Owen in Carroll Parish, Louisiana, on the night of January 18, 1854, taking with them a boat and a coat, rain pantalon, rain boots, and a vest belonging to their overseer. The coat, the overseer added, was a black frock or sack coat bound around with some kind of tape. There was cord on it in the shape of a barrel for fancy buttons. About 5 days later, it was later alleged, the escaped slaves were drifting down the Mississippi opposite Island No. 95 when a non-slave-holding white man named Gershom Brown, who lives on said island, caught them and took them by force to said island, and there kept them secretly and fraudulently and put them to work cutting cordwood, which he sold to passing steamboats. Several months later, having somehow heard that his slaves were on Island No. 95, Owen went down to fetch them. Rowing out to the island, Owen later testified, he spotted Gershom Brown on shore about 2 miles above the usual landing, whereupon Brown and his sons jumped into their own boat and, rowing at the utmost speed, passed petitioner and his friends under way, and got to the said landing first. When Owen finally caught up, there were no slaves in evidence at Brown's woodyard, and an awkward conversation ensued in which Owen and his friends gave Brown false names and pretended they had rowed out to the island to go hunting, thus gaining a pretext to keep looking around. Brown insisted, when finally asked, that there had not been any Negroes, runaways, or others on the island for several months. Brunswick and John were forced ashore in Vicksburg 2 days later, where they apparently told the whole story, although their testimony is lost to history because it could not legally be used in a case against a white man like Gershom Brown. Tom, wearing a cloth overcoat with loops and buttons, fine pants, casimere, a pair of boots, a black silk hat, a white linen bosom shirt and a cravat, the overcoat trimmed with braid, rowed out to a passing steamboat. He claimed that he was a free man from Pittsburgh named Bill Steele, who had been employed as a cook aboard the steamboat Sultana, but had been put off on the island after having some difficulty with the boat's steward. Some of the hands on board, including one to whom he had apparently given his memorable coat as he came on board, vouched for him, and he was enlisted as a fireman for the rest of the boat's journey upriver. In November 1854, one of Shepley Owen's sons saw the overcoat on the back of a white man in Louisville, Kentucky. He bought it from the man, who turned out to be the very man to whom Tom had traded it for his safe passage, and had it sent home to his father. It was later exhibited in court and identified by Owen's overseer as the very same coat that had disappeared on the night Tom had absconded. Tom himself was last seen in Cairo, Illinois in the summer of 1854 and was never heard from again, at least not by Shupley Owen. Tom had apparently made his way out of slavery along a fault line in the structure of Southern rule. The discrepant interests of men like Gershom Brown, and perhaps the man who vouched for Tom in return for a fancy coat, who could attain some of the privileges promised them by virtue of their race by betraying the loyalty to the slave-holding social order that their whiteness supposedly demanded of them. There were others like Gershom Brown, non-slave-holding white men eager to command, for a time, the services of a slave not legally their own. They included Amos Hall, who enjoyed Granville service aboard the steamboat Chieftain all the way from New Orleans to Louisville, where they parted ways. The mysterious particular friend who sent word to Walker Reynolds that he knew where Reynolds's slaves, George, Ned, and Dick, were hiding, and would return them for $1,000. The elusive Dr. Clark, who paid his way from Mississippi to Louisville aboard the Hercules by hiring out Peter and Samuel, who it was discovered belonged to someone else, to the unwitting ship's captain. Manuel St. Germain, who hired out Jacko to the captain of the steamer A.M. Wright, who, when confronted by Jacko's legal owner, said that Jacko was not Jacko, but William Henry, and that William had been hired to him by a Dr. Mercer, or was it Mercier? There is no way to know exactly how many slaves were stolen, the practice being an inherently shadowy and indeterminate one. At what point did passively failing to find a runaway slave's erstwhile master become actively stealing a slave? But it was frequent enough to be a matter of grave public concern. The penalties prescribed by law were severe, up to 20 years at hard labor for those convicted of stealing a slave. We believe there are worthless scamps prowling about in this community who make a business of stealing Negroes and who exist on the fruits of their infamous labor, wrote an editor of the New Orleans Daily Picayune in 1839. And among the slave stealers, there was none more notorious than John Murrell. Murrell needed, he bragged to Stewart, only 15 minutes to decoy the best of Negroes from the best of masters. The conversations between stealer and slave generally went something like this. Coming upon a slave walking on the road on a cold winter's day, Murrell would begin by taking the slave's side. "Well, old man, you must have a damned hard master, or he would not send you to mill this cold day." The slave, perhaps sensing a chance for some illicit interplay, why else would a white man start a conversation like that, would reply, "Yes, massa, all on 'em hard in this country." Murrell: "Would you like to be free and have plenty of money to buy land and houses and everything you want?" Well, who wouldn't? And then Murrell would make his proposal. If the slave would come away with him and consent to be sold several times, escaping each time only to be sold again, then Murrell would eventually set him up for freedom in Texas, outside the jurisdiction of the United States. In Stewart's telling, the game always had a trick ending. In order to protect himself, after a few sales, Murrell would murder his silent partners. One man, he told Stewart, he had cut open, filled with rocks, and sunk in a creek. John Brown almost ended up that way, but as he told it, Murrell's 1834 arrest by Virgil Stewart saved his life. Brown claimed that when he had belonged to a cruel-hearted man in Georgia, he was decoyed away by a member of Murrell's gang named Buck Hurd. Brown described the operation this way. They had stations in various parts of the country at convenient distances, and when a member of the club succeeded in stealing away a Negro or a pony, he would pass him on as quickly as he could to the nearest station, from which point he would be forwarded to another, and so on. Brown estimated that it was no problem for Murrell's gang to move a slave 300 miles without stopping. He had heard stories that Murrell had murdered one of the slaves he had stolen, ambushing him in the woods after telling him to go fetch some water. But Brown was desperate enough that he took up Heard's proposal. They spent their nights on the road, hiding in the woods and swamps by day, until Heard got word that Murrell was in prison in Tennessee. Heard got frightened and told Brown that he wanted to take him back, which he planned to do, by pretending that he was a slave catcher who ran across Brown in the woods. Brown agreed to the plan as long as Heard promised that he would get my master to promise not to flog me. We cannot, of course, rule out that Brown had read Stewart's pamphlet and constructed his own tale around the coordinates of a well-known frontier legend. Yet neither can we forget what Brown's account represents, a trace of the complicated give and take between stealer and slave that was suppressed in Stewart's rendering with the same typographic ease with which he dashed out the middle letters of the word damned. About the stakes in these traveling skin games, Murrell was quite clear when he told the story of a slave called Sam, whom his brother had stolen from a Tennessee man named William Eason. Sam had been sold out of his neighborhood to Eason, and so he was easily persuaded to go away with the slave stealer. He was quickly moved to, get this, Madison County, Mississippi, where he was sold for $1,400 in cash, $700 in ready-made clothing, and a draft on Thomas Hudnold for $700, which is as good as gold dust. Though he has to sue for the draft, that is, go to court to get the portion of the price that was unpaid at the time of sale, the recovery is surefire. They can never get the Negro, and without him they can never prove he was Eason's Negro. In other words, after Sam escaped from Hudnold, there was no way anyone could prove that the man identified on the bill of sale as, say, a prime Negro man named Jack, medium height, dark complexion, was the same Sam who had recently disappeared from Eason's farm in Tennessee. His brother, Murrell confided to Stewart, had made only 2 mistakes. He had not cashed Hudnold's note quickly enough, thus giving the planter time to cancel it when the slave ran off, and he had not killed Sam. Slave-stealing twisted the contradiction of human property, the governing fiction of the slave-holding South, into subversion. It was the human capacities of enslaved people that made them valuable, the fact that they could think and act and create. Indeed, and this was the heart of the contradiction, the human capacities of enslaved people made them uniquely valuable repositories of capital. Unlike real estate, they could be moved from place to place as the economy demanded. Unlike other forms of personal property, they could be repurposed to meet novel challenges. But along with the labor and the capital that made them so valuable to their owners, enslaved people were inhabited by their own slippery, sometimes subversive will. They possessed the ability to conspire with a man like Murrell, to play the part of property, cloaking their own aspirations in a series of sham sales until, like Sam, they had a chance to slip out from under it entirely. John Murrell haunted the uneasy frontier between value and its physical form. In order to be moved over time and space, capital had to be made material in one form or another. And whether it was by overtaking travelers along the Natchez Trace and stealing the metal and paper in which they were carrying home the value they had extracted from their sold slaves, by passing fake paper for good metal at a roadside inn, or by selling a slave who could never be proven not to be the man he was represented to be on the bill of sale, Murrell hijacked the capital's material hosts. He pried his way into the mechanics of an economy that had long since grown beyond its ability to accomplish the lightning-quick transfer of value that characterized the on-the-books economy of the country store, where a slab of bacon might be reduced to a 25-cent credit with the flick of a wrist. As value migrated from the real physical things that Murrell's victims bought and sold every day into the pure ether of unencumbered dollar values that they dreamed about every night, it had to pass through his territory, a territory in which things could be measured and compared by a price, but in which that price always had to be paid in a physical, movable, fakeable, and boostable form. But Murrell was more than a trickster freelancing along the frontier of exchange value. he had a network. Every fellow that would speculate that lived on the Mississippi River and many of its tributary streams, from New Orleans up to all the large western cities, was part of his clan, reported Stewart. Barely visible, in a midnight encounter along a country road, at the wooded edge of a planter's field, in the fantastic tale with which Virgil Stewart returned from the morass on the unsettled side of the Mississippi, was the ghostly underside of the cotton economy, stretching throughout its length and breadth, reversing its flows, switching its codes. Indeed, in Stewart's telling, it was Murrell and his men, not the slave traders, cotton planters, and commission merchants they preyed upon, who were the masters of this economy. It was they who understood the physics of the uneven movement of money and information through that network of streams, rivers, and roads, and could move fast enough and think fast enough to remain the master of each. Murrell's ultimate speculation was to use his shadowy network to excite a rebellion among the Negroes throughout the slaveholding states, and to manage it so as to have it commence everywhere at the same hour, on Christmas Day, 1835, the terrifying simultaneity of the event making it seem to the slaveholders as if they were facing an all-seeing invisible enemy. In the midst of the confusion and disarray all over the South, Murrell and his men would slip into the cities and rob the banks, the nodal concentrations of the wealth produced in the region. As Murrell and Stewart rode through the morass, the plan was already underway, unfolding in a series of secret conversations between the agents of Murrell's clan and their contacts among the most vicious and wicked among the slaves. "We poison their minds," Murrell confided, "by telling them how they are mistreated, and they are entitled to their freedom as much as their masters, and that all the wealth of the country is the proceeds of the black people's labor. We tell them that all Europe has abandoned slavery, and that the West Indies are all free, and that they got their freedom by rebelling a few times and slaughtering the whites, and that they can marry white women when they are all put on the level." "But," Stewart asked, "what if their courage falters?" "They will be forced to engage," Murrell replied, "under the belief that the Negroes have rebelled everywhere else, and would be encouraged by the promise to conduct them to Texas should we be defeated." Indeed, he had plans to disguise himself as a quack doctor and travel to South America, to get some friends in that country to aid me in my designs relative to a Negro rebellion. From the underworld of the cotton economy, Virgil Stewart claimed, he had, like his namesake, returned to warn the world of the vision of the future he had seen from the other side. Whole cities wrapped in smoke and flames, and houses and human beings together swallowed up by sheets of fire. Stewart's prophecy of the apocalypse of John Murrell remapped the territory of the Mississippi Valley and the rest of the South, and rewrote the history that had begun with the Louisiana Purchase. The sovereign boundary drawn around the slave South at the beginning of the 19th century was exposed in Murrell's plan as a comforting illusion of territorial and historical isolation. The history being made in the South was not the history that the slaveholders and cotton factors told themselves they were making, but another sort of history entirely. It was a history being made by their black slaves. And though that real history was evident every day in the physical labor with which those slaves created the country, it was yet hidden from view by the forced conversion of their labor into wealth credited to the substance of their masters, and by a stage-prop sovereignty designed to convince them they were alone in the world. Murrell's plan was to rupture the illusion. He would tell the slaves that the boundaries of their world were not defined by farm fences or state lines or international borders, or even by the global reach of the cotton economy. He would pry the history of the South away from that of the United States and reattach it to the history being made in what we would today call the Black Atlantic. In Haiti, where blacks had been ruling themselves for 40 years, in the West Indies, where the slaves had gained their full freedom in 1834, an event widely reported in Southern newspapers, and in South America where, he would assure them, there were many thousands ready to join them in arms. In the end, Murrell's apocalypse was to be a speculation structured much as were those on the top side of the cotton boom. Those who were reluctant to go along with his plan would be told that slaves everywhere else were already engaged, until each individual decision to join was prefigured by an image of a realized collective that was actually yet in the making, until all of the marginal players in the business imagined themselves to be riding a surge of events greater than themselves. Murrell, Stuart said, planned to rupture the history of American slavery with a speculative bubble of belief in the possibility of black revolt. When Stuart finally brought him in, Murrell was walked through the streets of Nashville, chained to a slave. It is hard to say what Virgil Stuart thought people would see in this apocalyptic fantasy, why he thought they would buy his pamphlet. Perhaps he thought that a vision of the end of their world would allow slaveholders to imagine themselves in extremis, to measure their mastery against a fantasy of its greatest test. Perhaps he thought he could draw back the curtain which shielded slaveholders from so many of their sins, to provide them with a negative image of the sum total of their own work in the world, their achievements credited to their slaves, their homes destroyed and their wives traded away, their nation under attack by an outside that was suddenly everywhere, their history suddenly made by someone else. Or perhaps he thought he had really uncovered a conspiracy that stretched the length and breadth of the South and that threatened to explode at any moment. Whatever the ultimate source of its attraction to its adherents, in the aftermath of the hangings in Madison County, Stuart's vision burst over the Mississippi Valley like a primordial thunderclap. On July 6, 1835, a fight that had begun between two men at an Independence Day celebration in Vicksburg turned into a riot when the citizens of Vicksburg gathered to drive the gamblers and sowers of sedition among Negroes from their midst. The panic soon spread to Natchez and Little Rock and New Orleans and Norfolk and Cincinnati, all of which experienced mob action against gamblers in the month of July. Those who were gamblers or who looked that way were forced to the river and packed onto steamboats or flatboats, which traveled from town to town looking for one that would allow their haggard passengers to come ashore. In the end, it was reported, many of them made their way to Texas. The mobbings were accompanied by a series of insurrection scares all over the South. In Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky, insurrection plots were uncovered and slaves were tortured and hung. In Mississippi, there were 3 separate scares in the months leading up to Christmas Day, 1835. In Louisiana, 4 more. For months it was said to be dangerous for anyone, any white person, to travel the roads in Mississippi. In succession, steam doctors, gamblers, slave dealers, clock peddlers, and finally missionaries were warned off the roads and driven out of communities up and down the Mississippi River Valley as slaveholders tried to choke out the enemy within themselves. And then, as suddenly as it had gathered, the panic dispersed. Newspapers that had carried seemingly daily reports from Mississippi began instead to fill their pages with extended discussions of the origins of the phrase Lynch's Law and its first usage in North America. Doubts about the full truth of Stuart's pamphlet were spun off into a detailed controversy, complete with a court case, the published testimonials of many worthy men on either side, and several more pamphlets, between its author and his former business partner about whether or not Stuart had been acting as his agent or merely his employee when he made several off-the-books sales, after which the other man seemed to have many fewer goods but little more money. The image of a commercial economy that was extended beyond its physical capacity to send information and safely move money, dependent for its daily bread upon a potentially insurgent labor force that had already penetrated its most intimate hideaways, pasted together by a racial ideology that was only skin-deep and protected from an outside world in which history seemed to be moving in another direction by only a few fictional lines drawn on a map, subsided into nostalgia. By 1836, Virgil Stewart was touring Mississippi not as a prophet of the disaster that was to come, but as the hero of an event that everyone seemed to believe had happened long ago and far away, fated on the 4th of July along with the Republic's dead founders. Like the terrors of the summer of 1835, John Murrell was consigned to the past. Gradually, Murrell's story became legend, part of the river lore of the flatboat era, the bygone times before the steamboat. Murrell died a savage jungle cat, crushed by the dawning age of steam, to which he could not reconcile himself. Alive, he had passed at various times as a lawyer, doctor, and a preacher. Dead, he marked the end of an epoch. The race, in short, of these singular beings is becoming extinct, wrote the traveler who called herself Matilda Hawston, commenting on white men such as Murrell. Like the Indians whom they resembled, these white men were being pushed by progress into banditry, drunkenness, and racial degeneracy. According to any number of travelers, the racial backwash of the steamboat era was apparent at every landing where the boats stopped to take on fuel. There, one could see men like Gershom Brown, the slave-stealing woodsman who lived on island number 95. Outcasts, squatters, men of broken character, worn and sallow with miserable, pallid children, Thomas Hamilton called them. Tall, lanky, unwashed men with clay-colored faces, looking for all the world as though they had been made of the same mud that dyes the Mississippi waters, wrote Mrs. Hawston. The squalid look of the miserable wives and children of these men was dreadful. Their complexion is of a bluish white that suggests the idea of dropsy, wrote Francis Trollope. Whatever they were, sallow, pallid, clay-colored, bluish, the woodsmen, their wives, and their children in these tellings were not quite white. They represented a sort of racial residuum, white men left behind by the progress of their race. The legend of John Murrell became part of the process by which class differences among whites were translated into other sorts of difference. Historical differences, which made poor whites seem like men from another time. Racial differences, which made them seem not quite white. Far from being extinguished by the capitalist transformation of the Mississippi Valley, however, these men, like John Murrell, Joshua Cotton, and Gershom Brown, were created by it. They were the aspirant cotton farmers whose crops had not yet come in, the immigrant laborers trying to work their way up, the second-order white working class who stitched together the political economy of slavery. They were clerks, coopers, and carpenters, shopkeepers, barkeepers, and housekeepers, actors, dancers, and prostitutes, slave traders, slave overseers, and slave catchers, steamboat men, railroad men, and night watchmen, typesetters, tailors, and tinsmiths, upriver truck farmers, Eastern fortune seekers, and European immigrants, riverboat gamblers, roadside bandits, and horse thieves. They may have been the relative losers in the process by which the Empire for Liberty became the Cotton Kingdom, the process by which the racial promises of white supremacy were foreshortened into the class privileges of slaveholding. But they were not going anywhere. Usually when they looked at their white faces in the mirror, they saw not yet winners rather than losers, and stayed loyal to the program. Sometimes, however, they saw themselves for what they were, incomplete members of a society in which privilege was defined by slaveholding even more than by race. At those moments, they would once again seem as dangerous to slaveholders as they had in the summer of 1835. 3. The Steamboat Sublime. A resistless feeling of depression falls slowly upon us, despite the gaudy sunshine and the green cotton fields,